This is a game played by another one of my students, Don, and it was played last Wednesday at the Fitchburg Chess Club. He had the black pieces, and he was up against Emily, who had white. Emily played d4, Don played d5, and after Emily's c4, he played knight f6. This is a defense known as the Marshal, and it's not considered very good for black. It looks similar to an opening called the Grunfeld, which is reached after d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, and d5. But the difference is that in the Grunfeld, after c takes d5, knight takes d5, e4, black gets to trade a pair of minor pieces on c3. And as I said in another video, that helps to lessen the advantage that white gets because of his extra space. In the Marshal, though, after white takes on d5, which is what happened in the game, and black recaptures, when white eventually plays e2 to e4, there is no knight on c3 to capture, which means white's space advantage is amplified. Not the space advantage itself, but the indirect benefit of the space advantage is amplified because there are more pairs of minor pieces left on the board. White played e4 immediately. I don't think that's recommended. I think typically white plays knight f3 here. And the idea is that after some move for black, when white plays e4, if the black knight retreats to f6 and white, this is kind of complicated, but if white guards his e4 pawn with knight c3, there's no attempt at striking in the center with e5 because the knight from f3 helps the d-pawn guard that square. But Emily played e4 immediately, and after knight to f6, if she had played knight c3, I don't know if it's a good move or not, but black can at least consider e5, counterattacking in the center. But Emily instead played the move e5. And while this takes a lot of space for white, while white now has more space than he did a moment ago, than she did, pardon me, it gives up control of the d5 square, which becomes an outpost for black pieces. And black should immediately put the knight back on d5. Don made a mistake, though, and retreated his knight to d7. Emily played bishop c4. Don played e6. Knight f3 from Emily, continuing to develop her pieces. Bishop e7, Don's doing the same, very good. And after castle, he played knight b6, harassing the bishop on c4. White played bishop b3, and then Don castled. As I've said several times in the past, castle kingside is either the best or second best move in almost every position in which it's legal. So it's really hard to go wrong with that move. White played knight c3. Black played bishop d7. And d5 from white. I'm not a huge fan of this move because white right now has a nice space advantage thanks to these d4 and e5 pawns. And there's an important rule to know about kingside attacks, which is that when white has a pawn on e5, he should be more inclined to attack on the kingside. And the same thing goes for black when he has a pawn on e4. And why is that? Well, with a pawn on e5, white is keeping black minor pieces off of the f6 square. And without the ability to put a knight on f6, black has a hard time defending h7, making a kingside attack more likely to succeed. Of course, the same thing is true in reverse when black has a pawn on e4. He is taking f3 away from a white knight, which makes h2 more vulnerable. So if I were white, I would not play d5, causing a bunch of trades which lessen white's advantage, I think. I would instead try to develop my pieces in a way that makes threats on the king side, and in a way that builds up my pieces behind my nice center on d4 and e5. And if I eventually play d5, it'll be played at a time when I have all of my pieces involved in the game, and opening the game is likely to result in me getting some kind of favorable tactics, because my pieces are more active. So I would have played something like queen to d3. And the idea here is that the queen's staring down at h7, and if we give black another move, for example, bishop to c6, white can play bishop c2, and is immediately threatening checkmate on h7. Black would have to respond to this with some kind of weakening pawn move, pardon me. In fact, I think in particular he has to play g6. And now black is weak on the kingside dark squares. And white has hope of exploiting that at some point in the future using his dark squared bishop, maybe also bringing his knight into the game, involving his... I keep saying his, but Don was playing against Emily, so I should say her. White has a hope of exploiting black's kingside here on the dark squares by using her pieces to invade. But instead, Emily played the move d5. It's not a bad move, because white's pieces are better than black's pieces right now, and so opening the game should tend to favor white. I just think it's not as strong as launching a kingside attack. Don correctly traded on d5, eliminating one of white's center pawns. Emily took back, knight takes d5, and Don took the opportunity to trade off a pair of minor pieces. And again, he has less space, so that's probably a very good idea. Bishop takes d5 from Emily. And now the move c6, which is not a bad move. It scares the bishop for white off of the d5 square. But the follow-up I don't like very much. Bishop to g4. It's important to try to get all of your pieces into the game in the opening and middle game. And so what I would do if I were Don here, what I would have done if I were Don, is try to find a way to get the remaining pieces into the game. I would have gone for the move knight to a6. And the idea behind this move is it activates the knight, and the knight can continue its journey going to the c5 square, where it'll harass the bishop on b3. And where it'll also possibly come to e6 to blockade white's e5 pawn. Don played bishop g4, pinning the knight. Emily played h3, and Don played bishop h5, maintaining the pin. And Emily played queen e2. And I think it's pretty clear that if there hasn't been an opportunity already, there will eventually be an opportunity for white to play the move e6, trying to break open the light squares on black's kingside, and black won't want to make an awkward move with his f-pawn in response. Don played knight to d7. Here might be a time to play e6, because as I've mentioned in the past, when you see a knight on d7 for black, and a pawn on f7, and a white pawn on e5, and nothing on the e6 square, you should strongly consider the move e6. White played rook d1, pinning the black knight to the queen, and Don played queen c7, putting more pressure on the c5 pawn. And in fact, he is now threatening to take on f3 and take on e5. Emily played bishop to f4. And now is a time when Don has an important opportunity. The bishop on f4 is undefended, which means white probably isn't going to immediately play e6. Well, maybe he will, but she certainly won't play it if Don plays knight c5 here. And the idea is to harass this bishop on b3. White can't really play e6 because black will just grab a piece on f4. And so, after knight c5, black's hitting this bishop on b3, also threatening to come into e6, which is a good blockading square that'll prevent white from revealing an attack on the black queen. But Don played bishop takes f3 instead, and his idea was that after queen takes f3, he's going to grab the pawn on e5, knight takes e5, which is a very, very dangerous way to play. White's bishop is already staring down this diagonal, and so black is walking into a pin. Emily played queen g3, a nice move that puts more pressure on the knight on e5, and of course that knight can't move, or the queen on c7 will be captured. And it might be tempting to try to break the pin with bishop d6 here, but Don did not fall into this trap, because white is a trap because white here can play rook takes d6. After queen takes d6, bishop takes e5. And white is up 2 bishops for a rook and a pawn, which is technically the same material count, but the bishops, you'll find, will routinely outperform a rook. So Don played bishop f6 instead, which does not get out of the pin, but defends the knight on e5 for now. And that's a good move. Emily played rook d2, and Don broke the pin with queen a5, maintaining the defense of his knight on e5. Emily played rook a to d1, and after knight g6, Emily's bishop is under attack on f4. Okay, this position is very good for white, possibly winning for white at this point. The rooks have control of the d file and are going to come into d7. White's bishops are very strong, and white's queen's reasonably active, whereas black can't really compete with this rook on f8, the rook on a8 not doing anything, and the knight on g6 is just not going to be as strong as one of these white bishops. Emily plays bishop d6, and unfortunately, black blunders here with rook f to d8, allowing bishop c7, forking the queen on a5 and the rook on d8. Dawn played a tricky move in bishop e5, but unfortunately, the tactics work out for white. Okay, and Emily finds an interesting move here in bishop takes f7 check, I think with the idea that if king takes f7, she's going to play queen to f3 check, getting out of the attack of this bishop on e5, and then she's going to take the queen on a5, and that should be an easy win. Another way for white to go would have been to take on d8 with check, and after rook d8 again, we'll force knight to f8, and now the queen can be captured, and then the bishop on g3 can be captured, and white is up a bishop and a rook for a pawn. Emily played bishop takes f7 check. Dawn played king f8, avoiding losing his queen for something other than a queen, but unfortunately the tactics still work out for white. Emily played bishop takes a5, and after bishop takes g3, she played bishop takes d8. Dawn played on a bit with bishop e5. White played rook d7, taking over the 7th rank, eyeing all of the pawns on that 7th rank. Black played bishop takes b2, rook b7. Knight e5 from black, but Emily captured the bishop on b2, and even though black now captured the bishop on f7, white was up a rook and went on to win the game. So that's game from Dawn, and I think it illustrates a few important things. One is to remember that this martial defense is not a good defense, and that black, if he wants to play d5 like that, should wait till there's a knight sitting on c3. Another is that when your opponent gives you an outpost like this, make sure you take advantage of it. Okay, and there's one more thing I forgot to mention earlier, which is that when your opponent has a strong center like this, you have to try to break it down somehow. And if you don't do that, eventually the opponent is just going to build up his pieces behind it. And then it's not going to be possible anymore to break it down. So black should have tried something like c5, with the idea that after d takes c5, queen takes d1, rook takes d1, black as bishop takes c5, recouping the pawn. And white's probably significantly better here because of the much more active pieces and the extra space given to her by the pawn on e5. But at least black has taken a step toward equalizing. That's about it. Thanks for watching, and let me know what you think.